Do you suffer from numbness, tingling, burning, or pain in your feet and legs? It could be caused by something as simple and common as a B1 deficiency. This is Dr. Ronald Hoffman with a solution for low B1, Zobria by Realm Labs. Zobria is a safe, effective, and clinically proven nutritional supplement containing a high-potency bioactive form of vitamin B1, which has been shown to reverse symptoms caused by low B1 with no side effects. Low B1 causes your nerve cells to stop functioning properly, resulting in numbness, tingling, burning, and pain in the feet and legs. It may also contribute to forgetfulness, loss of mental focus, fatigue, and loss of appetite. Restoring proper B1 levels has been shown to improve the functioning of these nerve cells. You can get Zobria risk-free by going to zobria.com. That's zobria.com and get 20% off with coupon code Hoffman at checkout. This offer is only available to Intelligent Medicine listeners. That's zobria.com. Vitamin B1 perfected. Welcome to today's Intelligent Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ronald Hoffman. Today's subject is, well, it's the meat controversy. Is meat good for you? Is it harmful? Today we're going to talk to the author of a wonderful book entitled Defending Beef, the Ecological and Nutritional Case for Meat. Yeah, for meat, not against meat. This is not a vegan diatribe against the consumption of animal protein. It's actually a pro-meat book. Huh, what a difference. And this is actually the second time that I've interviewed the author of this book, Nicolette Hahn-Niman, Niman, about this book. This book came out originally in 2014, but there's a brand new revised and expanded edition that just came out this year. It's a magnificent piece of work, which is really methodical and scientific, and that reflects the background of today's guest. She's originally trained in biology, but she's also an environmental lawyer, and she's going to tell us how it came to be. Originally, someone who was an enthusiastic vegetarian, as an environmental lawyer, concerned about the depredations of the livestock industry on the environment. But she came to take a more nuanced view of meat consumption, and that's reflected in this book. Nicolette, it's a pleasure having you back on Intelligent Medicine. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So why is it that you updated the book? What's the difference between the 2014 edition and the 2021 edition? Is there new information, new revelations, or a new perspective?
Yes, I'd say all of those. I had the book out there and had done a lot of writing and speaking, kind of following up from it. But I kept thinking the book was almost more and more topical as time passed. And there's more and more research that's come out, both on the health side and on the ecological side, especially with respect to climate change and soil carbon and that sort of thing. But the book was kind of getting older just by virtue of, having been written a few years ago. And the publisher asked me if I wanted a chance to update it, and I said yes. I jumped at the chance. And I thought it would just take me a few months because I thought, well, I'll just put in the new research. And then what happened was I started going through it paragraph by paragraph, line by line, and I realized that I actually wanted to rewrite the book pretty significantly because my perspective on the issue, while not radically different, it has evolved quite a bit. So I kind of went through and kind of recast the book to match my current thinking about these issues, and then I also added a lot more research on both the environmental side and on the health side.
And indeed, the diet wars, so-called, have only escalated in the past 7 years or so because there's been a big push for reducing our meat consumption, a lot of concern about climate change, global warming. It's thought that animal agriculture is destroying the environment, is contributing to global warming. And these are issues that you tackle head on in the book.
Right.
in a very persuasive way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Plus, there's sort of a confluence between that and the health rationale for not eating meat, which I personally feel is sketchy, as do you. And that's the second part of the book, where you talk about the science behind the claims that meat increases the risk for cardiovascular disease, and the now obsolete science that suggests that it is a driver of cancer. You do a pretty good breakdown of some of the evidence pro and con on that. So I would recommend it to our readers who are concerned about diet. But you haven't always been an ardent proponent of meat, right?
Yes, that's true. I mean, I grew up in an omnivorous household. Both of my parents were, devoted omnivores. They were very interested in healthful eating and healthful living, so they always emphasized the importance to us of, eating a balanced diet and getting a lot of exercise. My mom had a big garden. We used to gather a lot of fruits and vegetables from our local farms in our community in southwestern Michigan, where I grew up. But I do remember my parents, in the 1970s, as I was, around, 7, 8 years old or so, deciding that we shouldn't have butter in the house anymore because, butter was going to contribute to heart disease. And so I remember them shifting to, Mazola margarine. So they had a few ideas that I don't, right? Yeah, exactly. They kind of bought into, a lot of the mainstream thinking about that, but they were very health focused. So what they did, sort of teach all of us is that, there's a strong connection between what you eat and how you live and your health, immediately and in the long term. So I think they instilled in my siblings and me, good habits of being concerned about that. And in college, kind of partly because I'd been, reared with this background of, really worrying about health and diet, but I was already quite involved in environmental causes, and I was majoring in biology, as you mentioned in the introduction, in college. And it just seemed to me that the right thing to do, if you were someone who cared about the environment and was also concerned about your own health, to give up, especially beef. I remember very distinctly that was the first meat that I gave up, because that seemed to me the most troubling of all the meats. It had the largest ecological footprint and so forth from what I was hearing. And in fact, I even remember, I have a sort of vivid recollection of going to an environmental meeting, and there were pamphlets saying that beef was the primary driver of the deforestation of the Amazon. And these were the kinds of things that were influencing me. So in freshman year of college, I decided to stop eating originally beef, and then I stopped eating all meat a few months after that. And I continued to do that for quite a few years. And when I was hired by Bobby Kennedy Jr. to work for the Waterkeeper Alliance in New York, I had been a vegetarian for over 10 years. He asked me to work on issues related to the meat industry because he was concerned about environmental problems being caused by large concentrated animal operations. And I sort of felt like this was going to just reinforce everything I already knew. It's kind of in line with what I was already thinking. But what happened was the journey led me down a kind of a different pathway, because I started to really look closely at meat production and its impacts and the very different impacts of different types of approaches. And through that job, that's how I met Bill Nyman, my husband of today. We just had our 18th wedding anniversary a couple days ago, so we've been together for quite a while now. But at that time, he was the leader of a group called Nyman Ranch. He was the founder and the CEO of the company. And that was a collection of farmers from around the country that were all attempting to raise meat to a very high standard. So follow, really careful environmental and animal welfare policies and practices. And it was really through working with those farmers and ranchers that I started thinking this distinction was very important.
So you came away with a little more nuanced view of the meat industry, discovering that there may be more regenerative, sustainable ways of doing agriculture.
Yeah, well, it was really the beginning of my understanding. I married Bill, 18 years ago, and have lived on our ranch ever since we got married, and that's in California, in Northern California. And so I've had the opportunity both on our ranch and on a lot of other farms and ranches that I've visited over the last couple decades now, to see tremendously different impacts when the practices are done well. And so, it's kind of this slogan that a friend of mine came up with that just summarizes everything I've learned, which is that it's not the cow, it's the how, and that is really sort of the crux of what I now believe and the message that I'm trying to constantly, forward in all my, talks and all my writings, because there's so much oversimplification. We all, live in this age where we're very busy. We were bombarded by information, and we kind of want simple solutions. We want simple explanations of problems, and then we want to be told what to do to how do we navigate this problem simply. And diet, of course, there's so much conflicting information. And one of the things I've noticed that's been most alarming is I've seen entities like the Harvard School of Public Health, for example, in their newsletter, they'll talk about something to do with meat, and they'll just say in passing, like, as we all know, this is bad for the environment, and it's like, geez, they're not even in their own realm of expertise. It's like, this is something we all know. And it's like, no, we really don't know that, and I've, of course, I'm communicating regularly with those types of groups and saying it's very important to make the distinctions, because what I learned first at that job at Waterkeeper as an environmental lawyer, but then more and more in my own work on our ranch and other ranches, is that when you raise animals in a way that attempts to mimic natural systems, you not only don't have negative effects, you actually have tremendous positive effects. So there's a lot of talk in the environmental community about mitigation, mitigation of negative effects from, whatever human activity, but especially when you're talking about the meat industry, there's always this reference to mitigating the harms. And what I keep trying to get people to think is we're not even really talking about mitigation. When you're raising animals well, they're not a negative force that needs to be mitigated. They're a positive and necessary force to make, whatever food system you have, either on a particular farm or ranch, or when you're talking about globally, they really add things that we don't have without them. So they have a positive ecological effect in a lot of different ways. And I can, talk about the specifics for hours, obviously, so I'm happy to go into that. But that's kind of the bottom line of it.
And, you make the point, and it's an interesting point, is that before the advent of human hunters, which was perhaps, a couple of 100,000 years ago, the prairies of Europe and forested areas, in fact, but mostly the prairies, the huge prairies of landlocked America, were inhabited by large-bodied herbivores, millions and perhaps tens of millions of them, grazing on the vegetation and depositing their wastes on the earth in a kind of stable ecosystem. And then we began to, actually, we made a lot of these species extinct. The Native Americans preserved the buffalo as a source of sustenance, of which there were millions, and they were almost annihilated with the onslaught of the whites from in the 18th century and 19th century. And so that there is sort of a natural precedent for having a lot of grazing animals, isn't there?
Yeah. In fact, I think it's very important for people to understand that the Earth co-evolved with these huge herds, because when you're thinking about how we try to, repair the damage that humans have done to the Earth, which is, is enormous, and I mean, even if you don't talk about climate change, which is kind of the looming issue most people are thinking about these days, just thinking about soil and about the abundance of it and the life that should be in soil. We've lost this enormous quantity of soil through agricultural practices, especially through plowing, even when we started with very primitive plowing techniques, but especially nowadays with these huge, giant tractors and massive fields where we have, these enormous machines, and then the application of chemicals as well in agriculture has been tremendously detrimental in terms of the health and the life that should be in a soil, and that is really kind of the key to having truly regenerative systems. So the humans have done this sort of massive damage to the earth. But what's fascinating is if you think, okay, how do we repair this, and on a global scale and then on a, site-specific scale? And what more and more my research has convinced me of, and what I've seen as well with my own eyes, is that when you try to, as the Australian author Charles Massey says, understand the landscape function of a place, and you try to restore that and try to think how is this landscape supposed to function, and you try to figure out how to make that happen. It turns out animals are a really essential part of that. And it's because they co-evolved with the earth. They co-evolved with the evolution of grasses. They co-evolved with the evolution of these large open areas on the earth. We often think of the sort of pre-human earth as being sort of forested, from one sea to the other. And there were a lot of forested areas, and there have been, parts of the earth that humans have taken the trees down on. There's no doubt about that. But there was also, long before humans came about, for tens of millions of years, there were large herds of grazing herbivores, and they helped to create and to maintain the existence of these large open spaces in vast stretches of the earth on the globe. So when we think about what does the earth need and how is it supposed to function, it's very clear that that large grazing animal and all of the things that it does ecologically is very important. And human activity, as well as other forces, like the naturally changing climate that happened over, during the Ice Age and post-Ice Age, et cetera, those forces dramatically reduced the numbers of those large grazing animals and the impact that they were having. And so part of what I'm arguing and what people like the wildlife ecologist Alan Savory are arguing is that if you want to understand how the earth is meant to function, you have to look at this longer arc of history. And when you do that, you understand that you have to have these grazing animals. And so we have to use the domesticated grazing animals as a proxy for those disappeared wild grazing animals. We still have, some bison in North America. We still have some caribou in the Arctic. We still have fairly large numbers of, Cape buffalo in the Serengeti. There are areas on the globe where you still have some of these big herds, but they're really just remnants of what was once on the earth. And so when you think about the numbers of cattle and other domesticated large grazing animals that are on the earth, it's still quite a bit smaller than what is believed to have been here one day in the terms of the wild grazing animals. And so that's part of what, I'm trying to point out in the book, is that people sometimes think that we have these huge herds of cattle that are, overwhelming the earth. Well, it really isn't true. If you think about the long history of the earth, we've had these big grazing animals. They've played a very important ecological role. And so the key, again, is the how. If we're managing those animals well, and we manage them in such a way that they can have a similar impact to the impact that these large disappeared wild herds once had, that actually helps the earth to come back into balance rather than pushing it further toward the brink, which is what the sort of popular narrative is right now.
Okay, folks, at this point, let's pause and allow one of our sponsors an opportunity to share this vital message with you. Naturally occurring black pigments in vegetables, spices, and seeds have been found to have powerful anti-inflammatory effects. Hi, this is Dr. Ronald Hoffman, and I'm excited about what I think may be the next big thing in anti-inflammatory supplements, a brand new, all-natural daily preventative against a host of possible inflammatory issues. Black for Health liquid extract from Future Farm Botanicals. Black for Health combines 4 plant-based foods: black garlic, black radish root, black cumin seed, and black peppercorn, containing high levels of body-ready healing botanicals. Black for Health supports your liver, skin, cholesterol, blood pressure, and weight management, circulation, and immunity. It's a tasty supplement with liposome complex for optimal absorption. For more information, order. Call 888-841-7216, 888-841-7216, or go to myfuturefarm.com/Hoffman. That's myfuture, Pharm, P-H-A-R-M, myfuturefarm.com/Hoffman, myfuturefarm.com/Hoffman. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting our sponsors. They're what make intelligent medicine a continuing free resource to you. And now back to today's guest, Nicolette Hahn-Nyman, author of Defending Beef. Well, let's tackle some meat myths, okay?
Yep.
We talked about how meat production may actually not be harmful to the environment. Among the meat myths are that the methane that is released not in cow farts, because they often talk about cow farts. It actually turns out that most of the methane that's excreted by large grazing animals comes out in the form of burps, right?
That's right. Yep.
That methane is a significant contributor to climate change, global warming, the greenhouse gases.
Yeah, I've even encountered, multiple times I've had people say to me, well, I really don't eat beef anymore because of the methane issue. And that's part of the reason in this new edition of the book, I spend a great deal of time on the methane question. I really get deeply into the science on it, trying not to make it boring, but it's kind of important to get into the weeds on that issue because there's so much misunderstanding of it. And interestingly, that's one of those things where more and more research has come out in very recent years. So it was really important for me to add a lot to the book about methane. There are many things that can be said about it, and I go into detail in the book, but the sort of summary bullet points are this. First of all, the grazing animals that we were just talking about, the large grazing animals that once covered much of the earth, most of these were ruminant animals that produced methane. So there's kind of been this large portion of methane that was produced by large grazing animals almost sort of from the beginning of the Earth's history. For tens of millions of years, let's put it that way. And so one thing that's important to note is that the grazing animals that are there now, the domesticated grazing animals, are not adding a new amount of methane. They're sort of maintaining a historic load. In fact, it's probably dropped down quite a bit because we have fewer domesticated grazing animals. But more importantly, the methane question overall has been really misunderstood by the fact that they've created this sort of carbon equivalent. You talk about carbon dioxide having a certain amount of impact, and you talk about methane having a certain amount of impact, and you sort of equate them in a mathematical way. You say one molecule of methane equals, 23 molecules of carbon dioxide, or whatever you want to make it. And that's just basically false. And this is something that I learned about from Dr. Miles Allen, who is not only a physicist at Oxford University and an expert on methane, but he was actually on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change's scientific committee for several years. And he has worked, very directly on international policy on climate change. And I have seen him talk a number of times. I've seen him on YouTube, and I met him and spoke with him directly in person in England a couple of years ago. And I learned from him that this idea of equating methane and carbon dioxide is just simply false in the real world. As he said to me, it kind of makes sense on paper, but it really doesn't work like that in the real world. The reason is because carbon dioxide, whether it's emitted from a car or some other source, is what they call a stock gas. The emission goes basically into the atmosphere, and it essentially stays there for hundreds of thousands of years. So from the perspective of how we're thinking about these questions, it's essentially there forever. It just builds up. This is not what happens with methane. Methane is a very different kind of gas and is very short-lived. And it actually breaks down around 10 years. So it has a whole different way of functioning in the environment. And when you're calculating how much methane something is causing and what its global warming effect is, it should be a completely different approach, according to Dr. Allen. And he says that really we just can't use the modern metrics at all. And he's actually created a totally different metric. And I give an example in the book that shows that if you do that, if you use the metric that he says is more accurate of the actual science in the real world, it shows that you can't attribute any global warming to the cattle herd at all unless it's actually increasing in size. And in fact, he shows that, there's this kind of historic load that you could attribute to the grazing animals. And then unless you had significant increases, you really shouldn't be attributing any global warming impact to them at all, which is very, it's very fascinating to understand the issue in a different way. And that's the real science of it. I talk about a lot of other aspects of it, and just the fact that, you have the fossil fuel industry emitting enormous amounts of methane. In fact, I've just posted a few things on Facebook in the last couple of weeks, new documents and reports that have just been produced measuring the methane leaks from various natural gas production facilities around the world. And there were massive amounts. None of this is currently being measured or in any way regulated. So, the bottom line is focusing on cattle is really a red herring. And I go through, a lot of detail on this in the book, like I said, but that's kind of the bottom line. It's not really something that is a major problem. There are also good ways to mitigate it that are being studied around the world at agricultural universities. And when you're really looking at regenerative systems, the methane problem is dramatically less because of the fact that you have healthy soil bacteria, which actually will consume more of the methane, as they do in any ecosystem. There's always kind of a balancing. There's something that causes something, and there's something that consumes that thing. So, when cattle are viewed from a bigger picture perspective, I think the methane issue almost totally goes away. It's not that it's totally untrue. It's that it's been vastly overblown and misunderstood.
So another myth is that, and this is part of the narrative, was that meat and full-fat dairy used to be relatively scarce, that, they were, an accoutrement to the diet on small subsistence farms where people mostly ate fruits and vegetables. But now with modern industrialized processes and prosperity, we're eating so much more meat. It's unnatural.
Yeah. And just that whole question of how much, animal fat we're consuming, I think people do generally tend to think that. They think that number has just gone up and up and up. And what I did for the original book and also refreshed it for this newer book is I went back and looked at the original records that have been kept, for the last, 150 years about what's being produced and what's being consumed in the United States. And it's very, very clear when you look at that we're actually consuming quite a bit less of, just about everything that, would have been blamed for, heart disease and things like butter, whole milk, red meat, beef, pork, whole eggs. All of these things have gone down. Our consumption of it has actually gone down. And in the last couple of decades, we've actually dramatically reduced our red meat consumption in the United States and in other industrialized countries as well. It's gone down by about 25% in the last couple of decades in the U.S. But interestingly, what's been replacing it is things that are, now beginning to be scrutinized a lot more heavily, such as, all these kind of industrial produced seed-based oils, things like corn oil and soy oil, and also, of course, there's the whole question of palm oil and other types of fats that we've replaced the animal fats with. But when you just look at the demographic data, the animal fat consumption and the total consumption of meat, red meat in particular, has not been increasing. It's generally been decreasing.
Okay, our regular listeners know that we divide our podcast into two parts. In part two, we're going to tackle some more meat myths. The book is Defending Beef, the Ecological and Nutritional Case for Meat. Our guest is Nicolette Hahn Nyman, and we've got more to discuss in part two, so stay with us. I'm Dr. Ronald Hoffman, and this is the Intelligent Medicine Podcast.